Hello, this is another story for the Halloween season. It's called The Mirror. William stood surrounded by three great black sacks filled with stripped wallpaper, and he felt it was a job well done in his new bedsit to get rid of that awful, hideous, chintzy wallpaper that looked as if it had been up there for decades. The landlord had said when he had taken the place the day before that whether he wanted to keep it as it was and keep the furniture of the previous tenant, or if he wanted to ditch it all, was entirely his own affair, and certainly not something that the landlord wished to be bothered with. And at first he thought he would keep things as they were because it was much less hassle and he had plenty enough to do unpacking these boxes of books and DVDs and clothes and one thing and another. But an uncomfortable night spent on the rickety old folding up bed, the sort that tipped up into the wall, on a very lumpy mattress, staring at that awful hideous wallpaper because the street light was right outside the window and shone in even with the curtains drawn, it decided, well, plenty of things had to change, and the first thing that had to change was that wallpaper. Hence the morning and most of the afternoon spent scraping and scraping and scraping, because whoever had put it up there in the first place, whether it was the last tenant or the one before or the one before, William reckoned they must have used superglue rather than wallpaper paste, because it was murder trying to get it down. It really was. It took hour after hour after hour, even with the steamer to try and get the wallpaper off. It seemed to be determined to hold on to that plaster. But finally, it was done. The last piece came off, went into the bin liner, and William decided it was time for a well-earned cup of coffee. So, plugged his little kettle into the plug by the tiny little sink in the little kitchen area, made his coffee and sat down on a decidedly rickety chair, which creaked under his weight, and he thought this is going to have to go as well. And he looked at the state of the old table that the previous tenant had left there, and it was covered in well, who the hell knew what it was covered in? Something, some chemical residue or something. It was just too gungy for words. And debated whether it was sanitary enough to leave his coffee cup on there, but he thought, there's probably been worse in his coffee cup over the years. And he happened to glance at the mirror on the other side of the room. It was an old mirror, nothing particularly interesting. Been up there when he arrived, and looked as if, rather like the wallpaper, it had seen better days. It was foxed in places. The silver at the back of it was clearly going. When he saw a strip of that hideous wallpaper still up, I've just taken the whole damn lot down. How can I have missed one strip? And he turned to look at the wall. And the wall was bare plaster. And he looked back into the mirror. And there, quite distinctly in the mirror, he could see the rest of the walls were bare plaster, but there, right by the door, was a narrow strip of that hideous wallpaper still up. And he looked back, and nothing, it was plaster. He even went over and touched his hand down that part of the wall, and it was plaster, not only to look at, but plaster to feel. And yet when he looked in the mirror, he could see his hand was distinctly running over that hideous wallpaper. And when he was looking in the mirror, he could no longer feel the smoothness of the plaster, but that shiny, almost plasticky material that the wallpaper was made out of. And he looked in his coffee cup and thought, well, I've only had a sip or two, it can't be inducing hallucinations already. And then maybe he thought, well, going up and down with the steamer, if they did use some unusually strong type of glue to put it up, maybe it's released fumes. Maybe I'm starting to see things. So he went and opened the window and hung his head out and took some deep lungfuls of air, steadied himself, and looked back into the room. And in the mirror, there was nothing now. Just the bare walls reflected back, a perfectly ordinary vision. I must be overtired, I must be hallucinating. Perhaps I had such a bad night's sleep that I'm starting to see things. And he sat back in the chair. Well, maybe he was particularly tired because he nodded off, and the next thing he knew, he was waking up, and it was late at night. He could hear the traffic outside, the occasional hoot of an owl, and it was dark. He hadn't turned the light on, so he clicked that on and decided maybe make himself something to eat, because his stomach was rumbling. He hadn't eaten all of that day. And he pottered around, fetching and carrying and doing this and that, preparing himself a very, very basic evening meal. And rather nervously he cast a glance over at the mirror and nearly dropped the plate he was holding, because there in the mirror he could see the sofa. Except there was somebody on the sofa, and he spun round to look at the sofa, wondering who the hell it was that had managed to creep into his bedsit whilst he'd been snoring away. And there was nothing on the sofa, no one on the sofa, except the unpacked boxes of DVDs and books and ornaments and things. And he looked back in the mirror. And in the mirror, there were no boxes on the sofa. The sofa was uncluttered, except for the woman. And looking back and forth several times, he confirmed to himself that the sofa was empty, so he even went over and patted the sofa, and there was definitely no one there. Even when he closed his eyes, he couldn't feel anyone there, except in the reflection of the mirror. And feeling himself losing whatever sanity he had to start with, he stood and stared in the mirror. And he realised the woman was asleep. She was just at one end of the sofa, nodded off, not moving. And the more he looked at her, the more he thought she was familiar in some way. He couldn't place the face, maybe an actress perhaps, or some celebrity of some description at any rate. Somebody had seen perhaps in a newspaper, or maybe even possibly someone he'd passed in the street, perhaps somebody who worked in one of the local shops he'd walked past once or twice when he'd been out to get milk or something like that. He was new to the area, he didn't know anyone, but there was something familiar about this woman. And he closed his eyes again and thought, I'll count to 10. I'll count to 10. She's not there. I'm imagining her just as I imagined the strip of wallpaper earlier. She's not there. And he counted to 10. And when he opened his eyes again, he was on the floor. And he realised he must have fallen asleep or passed out or something anyway, because he was no longer standing where he had been standing, but he was just lying on the floor. And it was daylight. The dawn light was streaming through the window. Very nervously he stood up and looked in the mirror, and there was no woman on the sofa this time. He thought, right, this is not right. I'm going to start getting rid of stuff. And as he stood up, he leaned on the chair, which creaked and groaned beneath his weight, and something cracked within the chair. It didn't crumble to dust under him, but something decidedly cracked. And he thought, right, the chair can go and the table can go, because I'm not going to strip down whatever gunge it is that's been left upon the table. This has got to go. And so he spent the day back and forth to the town dump, carting unwanted furniture, because none of it was in a state where you could give it to a charity shop. It was just ratty and woodwormed and stained beyond description. All day long, back and forth. And as he came into his little bedsit to pick bits up and take them out, he wasn't exactly blocking his sight from the mirror, but he was doing his best not to look towards it, to keep his eyes upon the floor, his eyes upon the furniture, his eyes upon whatever he was holding, to not risk looking in the mirror and seeing anything he didn't want to see. He came back at the end of a good day's emptying and thought, right, having got rid of most of the old stuff, it was now time to start unpacking. The shelves were emptied of the previous inhabitants' few old books and possessions. Time to fill them up with his own books, his own DVDs, his own goods. And he started to unpack, all of the while not looking in the mirror, all of the while concentrating on his books, on his boxes, on his DVDs, and stacking them up here and stacking them up there. He hadn't even plugged in the television yet. He'd been so busy doing all of the other things. But he wanted his boxes emptied and to make this place his own, to put his own mark upon it. And at length, job done, back aching, legs aching, everything aching, he thought, a cup of tea and then I'll go out and I'll get a takeaway. He stood up and, without realising he was doing it, he turned and looked towards the mirror. And he saw the table. The table which he himself had taken to the dump and slung in to a skip a few hours earlier. But it was back. And he spun round to look, and the room was empty, but in the mirror the table was back. And as he looked in the mirror, he realised quite what he was seeing, because he was stood in the space that the table had occupied. And in the mirror, it was almost like he was stood in the middle of the table, as if somehow he had walked through the table. The very next day, he decided he would take that mirror and get rid of it, because whatever was wrong with that mirror, he didn't want to know. It was nothing he could begin to imagine. It was nothing he could begin to work out. But it had to go. And he wondered to himself why on earth he hadn't taken that mirror first off, instead of worrying about creaky old chairs and tables and crappy old cutlery and dirty old dishes. Why didn't he take the mirror? That would have been the most sensible thing to do first off. But he hadn't, and it was late, and the town dump was shut. He'd have to do it the next day. He thought, well, I'll go and get something to eat. I'm not going to look in the mirror. I am not going to look in the mirror. I will go and get something to eat. And he tried to close his eyes and walk through the non-existent table, except his eyes were drawn back to the glass of the mirror on the wall. And he saw not only was there a non-existent table in the mirror, but the non-existent chairs were also there. The creaky old one he'd been sitting on yesterday and another one that he'd thrown away that very morning were back in their original positions, as when he'd very first moved in to the bedsit, exactly as they were. And he looked at the shelves reflected in the mirror, the ones he'd just filled with his own books and his DVDs and what have you. And none of those books, none of those DVDs were there. They were just the few old books and the few broken old ornaments that he'd slung in the tip, the ratty possessions of the previous inhabitant. It felt as if the mirror wanted to go back to the way things were, with whatever person it was who had lived there before him, rather than accept what he was bringing to the bedsit. And he thought to himself, definitely the mirror goes first thing. And as he turned to go, his eyes caught sight of a knife on the table, the one in the mirror, because there was no table in the actual room. And he looked at the knife, a big old carving knife. Now that hadn't been there. That had definitely not been there when he moved into the bedsit. There'd been the table and the chairs and the ornaments and cutlery that looked as if it was engrimed with filth from the year dot, but there'd been no carving knife on the table. In fact, when he had emptied the cutlery out of the drawers in the tiny little kitchen unit in the bedsit, there had been a few old butter knives and a few old forks and a few old spoons and one old bread knife that was rusted to hell and back, but no big old carving knife like the one he was now seeing sitting on the table in the mirror. And even as he looked into the mirror, he reached out a hand behind him to feel where that knife ought to be. And he could see his own reflection in the mirror. And it was still him He wasn't turning into the previous inhabitant or anything like that. The mirror knew he was there. It wasn't him that the mirror was trying to change, but the room. And he could see his hand in the reflection reaching towards the table, towards the corner where the knife was sat. And by just looking in the mirror, not in the room, but in the mirror, he could feel the handle, the wood of the handle beneath his fingers. And he moved his fingers up a little and he could feel the steel of the blade. And very briefly, as his fingers strayed, the sharpness of the edge. And then something sticky, something unpleasant. And he took his hand away and there was nothing on it. It was just a hand, except when he looked at himself in the mirror, the reflected hand had what was clearly blood. And he thought, enough is enough. I'm going to go and get something to eat. I'm going to drink myself under the table with whatever I can find from the local supermarket. And I'm going to drink to the point where I pass out as soon as I've finished my takeaway meal. Sleep like the dead, like a drunken hog. And when I wake up in the morning, that mirror is out this flat, straight to the dump, smashed into 1,000 pieces in the skip. Job done. And he went. And, well, what he had to eat, he couldn't remember when he woke up. There were a few silver cartons on the table. What he had to drink, he couldn't remember for a few minutes until he saw the various empty bottles of vodka strewn around the flat, reflecting the light of the morning sun, as his head pounded and pounded and his mouth felt like the bottom of a parrot's cage. And it took a while for him to find his feet and get back up again, because he was sprawled on the sofa having fallen asleep there rather than got into that folding up bed, which was still actually folded up into the wall. And he didn't want to look into the mirror. He pottered around picking up the silver takeaway trays, and he picked up the empty bottles and put those in the bin liner. He didn't want to look in the mirror, except how would he take the mirror off the wall without actually looking at it? But he delayed and he delayed and he delayed. He made himself coffee, he had a bit of toast, standing in the most awkward position he could be in order not to look in the mirror, even though it was such a tiny flat you could hardly avoid looking in the mirror. Until at length he thought, well, it's got to go, and it's got to go now, and I can't not look at it whilst I'm taking it off the wall. So he approached the mirror, trying to keep his eyes averted until the very last moment. And looking up at where he thought the screws would be in the wall, where the mirror was screwed to the wall, he found himself standing full frontal to the mirror, not quite where he thought he was, looking at his own face. Every pimple, every blemish, every detail. And he took himself aback a little, because he hadn't realised he was quite as close to the glass as he was. And as he stepped back, he could see the sofa again. And there was the woman again, on the sofa. And he knew perfectly well, because he had been sleeping on that sofa himself only an hour or so beforehand, that there was nobody else on it. But he looked. He couldn't not look. He turned. And no, there was nobody there. Nobody at all, except when his eyes strayed back to the glass, there she was. And he thought about the feel of the knife handle the day beforehand, of how he had reached out his hand without looking at the non-existent table and the non-existent knife, and had still somehow felt both the knife and the table beneath it, and he wondered if he did the same. Would he feel the woman's hair? Would he feel her shoulder? If he reached out without looking at the empty sofa, but just looking in the mirror at the reflected woman. And he manoeuvred himself across. And he noticed that as he was manoeuvring, the table, which had long since been crushed to splinters in the tip, was back in the room, and the chairs were back in the room, and his DVDs and his books were gone from the room, and the previous items on the shelf were back. He shuffled towards the sofa until his legs banged into the sofa, trying not to look at the actual empty sofa. He reached out a hand behind him, and he could feel the material of the sofa. And looking in the glass, he could see his hand going along and along and along and along until there was the shoulder. And the woman in the glass didn't startle, awake, didn't jump up and say, "Who are you? Why are you touching me?" She just lay there, presumably snoring away. He could hear nothing, but presumably snoring away. He shook her, and she lolled like a rag doll, not like a sleeper, but like a rag doll, until finally she lolled back and her head fell to reveal the wound in her throat. A knife wound, clearly a fatal wound, for as her head rolled back, he could see she wasn't asleep, she was quite dead. And he could feel the sticky coldness of congealing blood upon his fingers. And as his fingers moved up, he could feel the coldness of her face. He could feel the brush of her hair. Even though he knew there was nobody there, he could feel it. He closed his eyes, shaking and shaking and shaking and thinking, oh, am I having a psychotic episode? Am I having a breakdown? Am I actually at this very minute sitting medicated in some padded cell somewhere, imagining this entire thing? But he thought, count to 10, open your eyes, look at the sofa, the actual sofa, not the glass sofa, but the actual sofa, and you'll see there's nobody there. Then get the screwdriver, take that frigging mirror off the wall, put it in a bin bag, take it down to the tip and smash it to smithereens so that nobody else ever needs to experience this sort of thing ever again. He counted to 10 and opened his eyes. He stared at the sofa. There was no woman there. He knew there was no woman there, but there was no woman there. And he realised that the clock, which he had put on the shelves alongside his books and DVDs, had gone forward about 3 hours later than it had been when he had tried to unscrew the mirror from the wall. And he'd only counted to 10. And this time he wasn't sprawled on the floor, so he hadn't passed out again. But 3 hours had passed in what felt like seconds of standing there counting 1, 2, 3, 4. Nervously he looked around. Everything else in the room seemed exactly as it had been. There, next to the kettle, was the screwdriver he had fished out of one of the many boxes, ready to unscrew the mirror from the wall, and he went and grabbed it and turned round and cautiously approached the mirror, trying not to pay any attention to the signs of furniture that he knew were not in the room. And he tried to unscrew the mirror. And as he was standing to one side, trying to unscrew those screws that felt so stiff, so rusted, they must have been in there even longer than the wallpaper was on the wall, he realised the wallpaper was back on the wall. as he'd thought it seemed to appear in the very mirror itself. And he knew that the walls were still stripped back to plaster because he hadn't had a chance to paint them or repaper them. But there it was back in the mirror. Not only the table and the chairs and the ornaments and things he'd thrown away, but the wallpaper too, which he'd stripped and thrown away. He thought, keep trying to unscrew, but they were so damn stiff. It was making his wrist ache like merry hell trying to unscrew the mirror. And his eyes kept straying to the glass, drawn like a moth to a flame. There was a figure, another figure, not the woman on the sofa, but another figure. And he tried not to look. It didn't matter who it was. There was nobody else in the room. It didn't matter who it was that was sitting in the rickety old chair at the gungy table. Whoever he was, whoever she was, didn't matter. Just keep screwing and screwing and screwing, except it was stiffer and stiffer and stiffer and harder, and the screwdriver kept slipping out of the screw because it was so damn stiff, and he could feel the head of the screw tearing. He thought, if this gets too damaged, he won't get it out at all. Maybe he'd have to get a crowbar and jimmy the damn thing off the wall, and that would probably take out half the plaster with it, and then the landlord would be charging him a fortune. He kept keep focusing on the practical. Don't think about the figure at the table. The figure that seemed so familiar, just as the woman on the sofa seemed so familiar. And he still couldn't place who she was. But she seemed so familiar. And at length, his hand aching so much, his arm aching so much, he just needed to stop and to pause and to give himself a chance to breathe clearly again. His eyes strayed to the glass, to the figure sitting in the non-existent chair at the non-existent table. And that figure also seemed very familiar, although the head was slumped forward and he couldn't see the face, but something about the hair, something about the clothing seemed awfully, awfully familiar. The idea came to him to reach out and touch the figure. He stepped back. He could see himself walking through the table, as if the table wasn't there, which it wasn't there. He knew it wasn't there, but in the reflection he was walking through solid wood as he backed up and he backed up. But he did it anyway, and he reached out a hand to touch the man in the chair. And as the reflected hand in the mirror touched the shoulder, he could feel the material of the man's shirt. He could feel the flesh beneath the shirt. He could feel the reality of it. And his hand moved up, and the man in the mirror was unresponsive. Until he reached the neck and could feel the coldness of the bare flesh against his hand and the hair, and he shook the shoulder and the head lolled back from the table, and he stood looking at his own face. Not his face, but the face of the seated figure, which was his face. He was looking at himself sitting in a chair and at himself holding himself sitting in a chair. But the seated version of him was clearly dead. And as he looked in the mirror, as the figure came backwards, he could see not a cut to the throat, but cuts to the wrists, long vertical cuts, the cuts of someone determined to end it, rather than the half-hearted attempts of someone who doesn't know what they're doing. The veins were open. The blood was congealed and dried, and suddenly he realised what that revolting mess had been on the table that he'd carted away and slung in the dump, which was now still in the mirror, looking at him. And he turned. It was too much. He turned away from the mirror. He wanted to smash the mirror. He looked around. There was a mug. He picked it up and he hurled it, smashed straight into the mirror, which shattered into 100 pieces, bits falling upon the carpet, spider webs of shatter still in the frame. And he could no longer see the figure at the table. He could no longer see the table. He could no longer see the chair. He could no longer see the woman on the sofa. All he could see were tiny bits of himself reflected again and again and again in the parts of glass still contained in the broken frame. And he thought, bugger the expense. If the landlord charges him for a smashed up wall, so be it. He would find the money from somewhere, but that mirror had to come down. He would go to the DIY store. He would get himself a jemmy. He would wrench that thing off the wall and throw it into a tip. And he reached out and opened the door to leave his bedsit. And as the door creaked open, he realised he was looking once again in a mirror.